The history of our Earth is so different from what we can imagine.
Enjoy the journey.
The Smithsonian, if they found out about a large skeleton somewhere, was to go get it.
I'm going to assume at least one person is right, because if one person's right, it busts the paradigm.
It all goes back to the fallen cherub. And the problem with the modern day church, they have a very truncated view of the supernatural.
This backdrop that's just pregnant with all kinds of meaning associated with this Mount Hermon event.
Welcome to Blurry Creatures.
And this guy defects from the kingdom. That's a big deal.
Welcome to the show, Dr. Laura Sanger. You're an author. You wrote this book called The Roots of the Federal Reserve, Tracing the Nephilim from Noah to the U.S. Dollar. That's how I found you. The book is, we've been talking about this on our show, about how these Nephilim creatures were all about dominance, control, consuming all the resources. And it would make sense that you get into the Federal Reserve and you just keep going back and back and back. So we'll let you tell us more about that. But you have an MA in Theology and a Ph.D. in Clinical Psychology from Fuller Theological Seminary, where you practiced clinical psychology for 15 years, specializing in chronic mental illness, addictions, personality disorders, etc. And we're fascinated to dive into this topic. Thank you for coming on our show and being here. So maybe just start us off with just a little backstory of how you kind of got to this place where you wrote this book, and then we'll ask you what your thoughts on Bigfoot.
Well, I feel like my journey, probably everyone's journey into the giants, is unique and unusual. But for me, I'm the kind of person that just absolutely loves to learn. So I am after all sorts of topics, no matter kind of how fringe they might be. And so I just absolutely love to research. I've been involved in some level of research since 1989. Some of that was in the field of psychology, and some of that was, with my master's in theology, but I really have never stopped researching or learning. And so as I began to dive into the topic of the Federal Reserve, this was back, I think it was in 2015, I listened to this podcast by Rob Skiba. I mean, you may have heard of him. He talks about the Nephilim quite a bit, but he had a guest on his show named Timothy Bentz, and Timothy is an intercessor. And so what that means is he travels around the world. The Lord leads him to different places where there have been Canaanite altars that have been erected. And so through prayer, he, is able to dismantle those Canaanite altars. And so anyways, in this podcast, he was telling about a time where he was returning from an overseas trip. It had been a long trip away from the family, wanted to get home, but the Lord told him, I have a side trip for you. I want you to go to Jekyll Island. And Jekyll Island, for those of you that don't know, is in Georgia, and it's the birthplace of the Federal Reserve. And so as I was listening to this, I had already started some of the research on the Federal Reserve. And so I was incredibly intrigued. And to make a long story short, he talked about his experience on Jekyll Island, particularly his interactions with the museum curator. And he discovered that they have artifacts and a collection of different items that demonstrate that the Temecuen tribe of Native Americans that inhabited that region, they actually were extraordinarily tall. And also it appeared that they worshiped at an altar that resembled a Canaanite altar. And so in this podcast, he started talking about giants and Nephilim. And I felt like the Holy Spirit just kind of nudged me and said, I'm going to bring you back to this. And so sure enough, a couple years later, I'm researching for the book that I wrote, and the Lord does in fact bring me back to delve deep into the Nephilim and the giants. And so that's a little bit of how I got involved in that. But I feel like the perspective I have on the giants is a bit unique in that one of the areas of expertise that I have is in spiritual mapping. I'm not sure. Are you guys familiar at all with that term, spiritual?
I've heard you talk about it, but I don't know if our listeners are familiar with that. But you can describe it for us, for those who don't know.
Okay, so spiritual mapping was coined by a man named George Otis Jr. Back in 1991. But essentially, what it is it consists of gathering research on the physical, social, and spiritual pulse of a society. And so it involves doing research to dig into, like, what are the ancient roots of defilement on a land that affects the people that actually live on that land. And so there's different facets of spiritual mapping, 3 main parts to it. So the first part is actually doing the research. So like I said, digging into historical documents, looking at newspaper clippings, looking at the demographics of a region, that sort of thing. But then also there's what's called reconnaissance. And that is essentially like what Moses did when he sent the 12 spies into the land of Canaan, or what Joshua did when he sent the 2 spies into Jericho. So what we do is we send teams of people onto the land. So whatever it is we're researching or whatever prayer assignment we have, we'll actually physically go on the land. And we have people that are particularly gifted in what's called discernment. So they can sense both physically and spiritually what is on the land and what's taken place on the land. And so it's tremendous. Some people would maybe reference that as people can feel the different energies on a land, whether that's negative or positive, low frequency, high frequency type stuff. So then we take that reconnaissance and we pair it with what we've discovered in the research arm of it. And then we put together what's called a prayer brief. And what that does is that it targets people's prayers, and it's called informed intercession. So the idea is you don't want to just pray random things and hope you hit your target. You want to know what it is the land is struggling with, what the people on the land are struggling with, what strongholds are there. And so it really equips us as intercessors to be able to go in and act as a mediator in that role of intercession and ask the Lord for forgiveness for the iniquitous acts that have taken place on the land. And so there's primarily 4 iniquities that can release a stronghold on the land. And that is bloodshed, broken covenant, sexual immorality, and idolatry. And so what we're able to do with the spiritual mapping aspect is, identify what's there, what's happened on the land, ask the Lord for forgiveness, cleanse the land, break those curses that are on the land, and then release the full measure of blessings. And really the ultimate goal of spiritual mapping is to see regions, cities, states, nations, whatever it is we're praying for, released so that they can walk in that full measure of blessing and reach their God-intended purpose. And so for me, the perspective in learning about the giants, it's not just for curiosity's sake. It's really to understand that there's a Nephilim agenda that began all the way back in the seed war in Genesis 3 that has been carried out throughout history and is currently operating in our day and time. And so it's defiled our monetary system and practically every institution we have in our country right now. And so learning about the giants was, like I said, it's not just because it's something I'm interested in. It was how do we understand what's busy happening behind the scenes that so many of us don't understand? And to bring to light this Nephilim agenda.
Some things like when you're describing all that, my initial thought is a lot of people describe, that they have a stronghold of demonic activity from their grandparents all the way down, and like their grandkids are dealing with issues. We interviewed a guy that had some similar activity, Luke, where some things were manifesting and following them around when they moved from house to house, and these entities follow them. And is this also, Tim talked a lot about this on our interview with him about principalities, and is that what you're kind of describing? Like these entities can take over in a certain area?
Yes, most definitely. And it's not only can they take over an area. So, for example, you have spiritual grids across the earth, essentially. And
ley lines?
Yes, ley lines, spiritual grids, portals, gateways, all of that. And so,
Wow.
So what happens is if you live in an area that has a stronghold and that has a lot of activity in the spiritual realm, it can impact you whether you know it or not. And so, for example, in Torino is known as the witchcraft center of the world. When I went there, now I don't have a super strong gift in discernment, but when I landed in Torino, it hit me immediately. I started feeling nauseous, dizzy, kind of this heavy weight. And it took a lot to press through that. And so we have friends that lived there that worked for the Olympics. And one of the reasons I went there is because of the spiritual mapping I do. When we hosted the Olympics in Salt Lake City, our team was instrumental in understanding the spirits that come with the Olympics and the effect it can have on those host cities. And so we organized a massive prayer event. But anyway, so I was invited to Torino because they were hosting the next Winter Olympics. And I worked with some of the church leaders in Torino. And it was incredibly intense. And so, some of the church leaders were aware of the spiritual grid over their city. But, the people living there may not understand the depth of it, but there can be accidents. So, for example, the Torino football team, or soccer, as we call it, I can't remember. It was like, I want to say back in the 50s or 60s, they crashed. Their entire team died in a plane crash near the basilica outside of Torino. And that's just an example. When you live in a place where there's a stronghold over that area, there could be increased suicides, domestic violence, substance abuse, unusual accidents, all sorts of stuff like that.
I mean, Luke, this reminds me of like a lot of what Roger brought up. He lives on a serpent mound. And he came on talking about this portal in the back of his property, and all this stuff's coming out. Cryptid creatures. He talked about these giant demonic crocodile things that were like killing animals in his backyard. And it puzzled a lot of our listeners because he's talking about these portals and these ley lines, and he uses divining rods to figure out what's there. And since his episode, Laura, I've been very curious about these portals. How do they work? What is this ley line grid? I mean, it sounds like you've done a lot of study on that. So I think that could help some of our listeners just to, what are these ley lines, and I mean, how do we know anything about them? How do we even start to unpack that?
Well, so I'll go back to my experience in Torino. So in staying with the friends that we know that were working for the Olympics, she told me that they were having experiences on their property. So witches were leaving fetishes. I don't know if you're familiar with what fetishes are, but they're objects that have curses attached to them, and they can release those curses on the land. And they were finding different fetishes on their property. Their children were getting injured in particular ways that had to do with fertility issues. And so they said that in one of their guest rooms, some of their guests that have come over the years, they would have specific dreams. Guests wouldn't necessarily know that this was happening, but it was happening so frequently that they're like, okay, the Lord's trying to show us something here. So when we came, I brought a team of youth with me because I've been in youth ministry for a number of years. And one particular youth has an incredible gift of discernment. And so anyways, our friend didn't tell us necessarily where in there was a portal, but she just wanted to confirm to see if we had any confirmation. And the guest room is fairly large. So it would be the equivalent of like 2.5 of our normal size bedrooms. So we walked in and you could feel the presence, the negative presence. And we walked right to where the portal is. And we said, it's right here. And she says, yes. The Lord had us just pray and break off and cleanse that land and reverse the portal. Because a portal is essentially, if you think about it, it's an opening between dimensions. And so I talk about different dimensions. I think about the spiritual realm. The spiritual realm isn't in the natural realm. So it's a different dimension. So you think about, Jacob's ladder in scripture, where he saw the angels ascending and descending. That can be a portal, but a portal can both be for angelic presence, but it can also be demonic if it's been defiled. And so we were able just to pray and break off those curses and when it happened and reverse that. So it was then an opening for the presence of God and the angelic. So then the other day, a couple days later on that trip, these youth are away from home. They're young. They're like 14, 15, 16-year-olds. And I just needed to debrief with them, take them for a walk. They're missing home, like I was saying. And we thought we were just going to go for this innocent walk in farmland below where our friends lived. And it turned out we were walking right in the midst of a ley line. And what I experienced there, I had never experienced. And this was like 10 years into doing spiritual mapping all over different states, different countries. And I was walking on the land and I began to see and feel, I don't know how to describe it other than energy or beings pass through me. And I liken it to, I'm a Star Wars fan. So I liken it to when the Millennium Falcon goes into hyperdrive and you see all those stars racing at you. Well, it was that only in reverse. They were moving away and I could see it not necessarily with my physical eyes. I could feel it with my physical body, but I was seeing it with my spiritual eyes. And so I mentioned something. There was 3 youth with me. I mentioned it to them. And one of the other youth couldn't see it, but was feeling the same thing. And so long story short, the Lord had us pray there as well. And what we noticed was that there was a real foul stench as we were walking. It smelled like a huge pile of manure, but we couldn't see any cows around. It doesn't mean that there weren't, earlier in the day or whatever, but it was a real strong stench. And after we prayed and broke off, severed that ley line and asked for the Lord to come in and bless the land, the smell actually changed to like this fresh pine scent, just fresh air, and nothing in the landscape had changed. We had not moved, but we did something in the spiritual realm, and it changed the actual physical smell. So I share that just to say that this stuff is real, but we don't understand it much. And so what ley lines are is you can think of them like highways or expressways. They're passageways of transportation for beings in the spiritual realm. So not humans, but things that are not human.
Is that like Elohim? Is that the word for that?
Right.
It could be, yes, Elohim or gods, yes.
It's one of the things that I've heard about recently and talked about actually with my pastor at one point was when you talk about these portals, is it the same idea as like a thin space, like the way that it's described, like maybe in the Irish tradition or whatever, where the veil between between this realm and the spiritual realm is thin, and so you have. Is that the same thing as a portal? Is that when we're talking, those are semantics? Is that kind of the same idea?
So I'm not super familiar with the term thin space, although I have heard people talk about certain high holy days in like the satanic calendar. So, for example, Halloween would be one, Sam Hain. And they talk about how the veil between life and death is really thin on those particular days, so that they can kind of tap into the underworld or the spiritual realm. I would say, so the difference would be portals are not tied to specific calendar dates or specific holidays. They can be established, whether it's, in the Old Testament, there's a lot of times where the followers of God would establish a memorial or a monument or build an altar of remembrance. You think about Bethel being a place where there was that direct communion with the Lord. That can be thought of as a portal. Portals aren't always bad. I think that's the point I want to get across, is that, there can be places where God has moved, like Azusa Street, for example, or other places where the Lord has just descended in his presence, and it's changed the actual land itself. The land remembers that experience, and so carries it with it. And so when you step onto that land, you feel the blessing and the presence. So that would be an example of a portal that has the blessing of the Lord and the imprint, of the Lord. But then there's those negative portals that can be established, whether there's human sacrifice on the land or, ritualistic sex acts, all those iniquities that I talked about initially. Those can establish not only a stronghold in the region, but a portal on that particular part of the land, where then it's like you're establishing an access point where the demonic can travel and establish kind of their plans and purposes.
This reminds me of a lot of the things that people talk about when they have, it all goes back to Bigfoot, but Bigfoot smells terrible. There's this terrible stench. People say they walk into like a sphere where it's like suddenly they have this crazy fear and then like they don't hear any sound. A lot of people say Bigfoot protects these portals in these areas that are around them. And a lot of people go missing in the woods. And a lot of people come onto shows like ours trying to figure out the phenomenon of people. It sounds like people walk through these portals and they're never seen again. And they just disappear without a trace. And there's a lot of guys in this space who are trying to do the science of that and say, look, there's thousands and thousands of missing cases in certain areas. Like on the top of Mount Shasta, there's supposedly some weird activity. And other places on mountains where people just disappear. And I'm wondering if, like the Bermuda Triangle, these boats are just sailing through these portals, never to be seen again. Like, there's so much there with these doorways. And we talked to Derek a little bit from Megalithic Marvels about some of these ancient megaliths that have doorways in rocks. And it looks like a portal, like that's like an actual doorway to another dimension.
Well, it's a doorway to nowhere in the physical, and then it's just a doorway in a stone. Yeah, all wild stuff. How does this? So I know we brought you on initially to talk about the Fed and the Federal Reserve, but one of the things, this all ties back to the Nephilim, and one of the things we'd want to talk about was the Nephilim agenda and how that plays out today. I know, Nate, we're also getting to asking her the question. Maybe we should start there.
Well, that's what I was going. That was what I was going with all that.
Yeah, I know. And now I'm just like, this is getting me sucked in. I'm fascinated. So maybe we should.
Well, it's great because it seems like guests come on our show in a timely manner. We launched into this thing. We had no idea where it was going to go. And every guest raises more questions. And then someone comes on and answers a few of those questions or gives us more clues. So forgive me. I jumped right into the portals and the ley lines. I'm so interested in that right now in my mind. But what do you think about Bigfoot? Is it, we just talked about it. Is it related to any of this stuff? Is it related to the Nephilim? Some people have said on our show they're pre-Adamites. I think that's what Tim Alberino said. They were like here first. There's some wild theories we've heard on the show. I don't know. You might, obviously you said you prepared for this question, so you tell us.
I did. Bigfoot for me is not a topic that I've really delved deep into, but I would have to say, the journey I was on in writing the book that I wrote, I had paradigm shift midway through. And, I wrote the book in what I call real time. So when I was writing chapter 5, I had no idea how all the loose ends would tie together. Like, I didn't know where we were going to end up, and I didn't even know how we were going to get there. And I say we because it was this journey with the Holy Spirit. But so in writing and doing a lot of research on the Nephilim and the giants and how all this is tied together with the Federal Reserve, I had some serious paradigm shifts. And so I think prior to writing the book, I would say, no, I don't think Bigfoot exists. But I would have to say, I can only offer my opinion because I really haven't looked into it. But I would say that it wouldn't surprise me if Bigfoot exists, because I think it could either be, a chimera, or it could be a descendant of the Nephilim. And I think you mentioned that people have reported a foul odor, and it reminds me of the giants on Solomon Islands. So I'm not sure if you're familiar, if other guests have talked about that. So
no.
This was a discovery in the research that I did, that I was like, oh my goodness, it blew my mind. So I'll share a couple of things. So the Solomon Islands, they are essentially a sovereign state of islands east of Papua New Guinea. So that's where it's located. And there have been numerous encounters with giants on this island. And so the islanders know that giants live among them in the interior portions of the islands. And so one of the islands in particular is called Guadalcanal. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but it's one of
That's World War II. Okay. Yeah, I know about Guadalcanal. There was battles there in World War II.
And so it's one of the larger islands, part of the Solomon Islands. And there's a lot of island folklore, but also eyewitness accounts of giant encounters. And so, the islanders know that the giants live among them. And there's an Australian man, his name is Marius Boron, and he moved to Guadalcanal for work. He was a pilot and an engineer, and he ended up marrying one of the indigenous women on Guadalcanal. And after 15 years of living there, he began to compile the folklore and also the eyewitness accounts of all these giant encounters. And he put it together in a book called The Solomon Island Mysteries. And so that book is fascinating because it gives a lot of information about what they experienced. So in some of the eyewitness accounts and with the folklore, what the islanders believe is that the giants have lived on their islands for several millennia, and they estimate the population of the giants to be in the thousands, which is remarkable to me. And so the giants have this elaborate cave system underneath kind of this mountainous rainforest area on Guadalcanal. And the main access point to the cave system is Mount Tatuva. And that's where the islanders have witnessed giants coming and going through that cave system. And there's a well-known story. This, really is shocking that it happened in the 20th and 21st century. So there's a well-known story of a woman named Mango. And I should say before telling her story that what the islanders have experienced is they have been terrorized by the giants for years and years. So they are afraid of them for, valid reasons. And so many of them have been abducted. They've been consumed as meals. These giants are cannibals. And so anyways, back to Mango, she was abducted. And after 25 years of being missing, they thought she was dead and long gone. She was found, and she was pregnant and frothing at the mouth. And she gave birth to what they call a half-caste boy, or a hybrid. And that hybrid lived for 5 years before Mango's brother killed the hybrid. And then Mango herself, she died in the year 2000. And it was after years and years of mental instability, because she essentially lived in the cave system with the giants for 25 years. And so that kind of a story, you think, okay, is this real? Can this really be going on Earth right now? On Earth right now. On Earth right now. On Earth right now. So in this book that I mentioned, he has encounters documented of some of the government officials from Guadalcanal. So from the Solomon Islands. So the first one is the third prime minister of the Solomon Islands, and his name is Ezekiel Alabua. And he tells of a time in his childhood where his father brought him to one of the burial sites of the giants among the cave system. And he saw a skeleton 15 feet, is what he estimated it to be. Then more recently, so the Guadalcanal premier, I don't know if it's the current premier. So a premier would be like one of our governors of a state. So the premier of Guadalcanal and then also the finance minister, they took a trip up to one of the mountains because the islands are rich in precious metals, particularly gold. And so they were going up to one of the mines, and they were in a 4-wheel drive truck, and it had just rained. And so on the mountainous road, they actually went off the road, off the ledge or edge, I should say. And they got stuck in the mud. And so they had to climb out of their truck, walk to the nearest village, gather about 30 other men to be able to get this truck up back onto the road. When they got back to the truck, they saw 2 15-foot giants that had lifted the truck from off the edge of the road onto the road. And you can imagine, I mean, these men just instinctively screamed and ran the other way. And after about 30 minutes, just a few of them were brave enough to go back to where the truck was. The giants were gone, but what the premier and the finance minister reported is that because it was muddy and wet, the footprints of the giants were still in the mud, and they estimated them to be between 3 and 4 feet in size. And so, you know, I find these stories coming from the Solomon Islands so incredibly valuable to the discussion of the existence of giants, because here we have in the 21st century and 20th century stories of giants roaming the earth. And it really is like this bridge between the giants of antiquity and the giants in the 21st century. And so that's why I think it's so important that we understand that the Nephilim and the offspring of the Nephilim are still roaming the earth, terrorizing those they come in contact with, and that they have an agenda, and we need to understand what that agenda is. So anyways, in thinking about Bigfoot, you know, I forgot one important thing that Marius Boiron described in his book, and I'll just read it. It's a quick quote, but what he does is he describes, so there's 3 types of giants, and in describing one of the types of giants, it really was consistent with what I had already found about the Nephilim and their giant offspring. So here's what he says. He says, these giants have long black, brown, or reddish hair, bulging red eyeballs, a flat nose, wide-gaped mouth, and an unmistakable odor. And so what the villagers and the coastal people would do is when the winds would blow and they would smell that odor, that's when they knew they were in danger and they'd take cover.
Wow.
So that is what connects for me, like, are some of those giants considered what we would think Bigfoot is? I don't know, but it's some interesting connections.
Sounds very parallel. It sounds a lot like some of the Bigfoot experiences, right?
Yeah, it sounds exactly like them. I think we should just give our show to you, Laura. It's yours now. You can host the show because you've got, I mean, just that one Kandahar giant story is like of those military guys in Afghanistan shooting that one giant. It's like everyone knows about this story.
Have you heard?
And we interviewed Tim, and Tim interviewed the pilot who supposedly flew this one giant out. You're talking about an island inhabited by giants today. One of our first guests talk about mountain giants in North America coming out of the ground in places like Canada. They're still underground in like these cave systems that you're describing. I think just the thought of one giant existing still, we're just chasing down some of those legends. But it sounds like we need to get a plane ticket, Luke, and fly out to this island.
Yeah. Let's do it. Let's not get close to the cave system, Nate. You got red hair. Maybe they're going to know you're friendly.
Exactly. Maybe I can slip in and
you wear your Giants hoodie you're wearing right now, and be like, "Hey, I'm playing for the home team, guys."
Hey guys.
Yeah. Hey.
But here's something that might be interesting. A lot of people are like, "There's no way." They're skeptical. They listen to this show. They come here for Bigfoot content, and we throw these things at them. But I've heard that Papua New Guinea has the most concentrated area on the earth with more languages than anywhere else in the world. So people can't tell their stories to each other as well, because you go a little bit around the island, it's another language. There's all these languages there. So things can kind of stay hidden on those islands, because people describe seeing, believe it or not, pterodactyls flying around those islands at night that glow in the dark and attack people. And I've seen a couple shows on this, and Papua New Guinea is a strange place. But he said that islanders can't communicate as easy because there's so many languages spoken there. I don't know. Well, is that why? Because I mean, imagine if that stuff happened here, you could be like, oh, it's going on in such and such, and we all speak the same language on this continent, so it's a little easier for information to travel around. But maybe some of these legends can stay hidden because of barriers like that. Simple things. Yeah. I don't know.
Laura, I want to get into this Nephilim agenda. You talked about it briefly there, and that's something we wanted to talk about and how it impacts us today. Obviously, like if we're talking about giants that exist in the here and now, there's definitely a direct connection, as you pointed out, back to the giants of antiquity, to what we consider to be the Nephilim, Genesis 6, and all that. I know you wrote your book about a lot of tracing the Nephilim to the Fed and all this. So can you unwrap a little bit of that for us?
Absolutely, yeah. So the Nephilim agenda, it was unleashed during the days of Noah, which probably isn't any surprise given how much you guys have dug into that. But the agenda is really to defile the human genome by propagating the hybrid race. And so the purpose of it is really to stage a coup d'etat on God Almighty. And what I mean by that, it really takes kind of going back a little bit to understanding the origins of the seed war, or the origins of the Nephilim agenda, and that's in the seed war. So that familiar passage in Genesis 3, where the Lord tells the serpent, I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. And so as a result of the fall, God declared war between the seed of Eve, which is humanity, and the seed of Satan. And so one day Eve's seed would crush Satan. And so really this is like the prophetic declaration of the coming Messiah. So Satan's strategy was to contaminate the seed of the woman, so that, that would alter the genetic code of humans so that the Messiah would not be able to be born. And this is really where I think the fallen sons of God become integral in Satan's strategy. So when they choose to leave their heavenly abode and invade the earth realm and mate with the daughters of men, they are defiling the human genome through the birth of the Nephilim, which is a hybrid race. And so the Nephilim are the seed of Satan. They're created in his image. And so if we think about, in the book of Enoch, we know that story well of how the 200 watchers descended on Mount Hermon. Well, one of the things that the Lord had me do throughout the book was what I kind of liken to performing an archaeological dig on language. Or another way to think about it is like looking through the telescope of vocabulary to reconstruct ancient events. And so what I mean by that is digging into the etymological roots of words. So for example, if we think about Mount Hermon, the Hebrew word for Hermon is Hermon. But then, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing any of these right, so we'll just have to have grace for what.
We're not experts either, Laura, so we'll just roll with whatever you got.
So that word Hermon, it comes from the root word haram. And haram means to completely destroy, exterminate, and to devote for destruction. And so it's that term that denotes Yahweh's utter contempt for particular acts of sin, or also the mixing of species, so that the hybrid race and what they did to defile the human genome. And so when God commands haram in scripture, he's really calling for punishment through total annihilation. And most times that has to do with the mixing of species. And so if we think about one example in the Bible where it talks about where God commanded haram is when he asked Saul to completely annihilate the Amalekites. Now, the Amalekites, they were these vicious plunderers, and they actually were the first foe to attack Israel when Israel exited Egypt. And we know from the Exodus story, Egypt had handed over their wealth to the Israelites. They leave with that wealth, and that catches the eye of the Amalekites. So the Amalekites wanted the plunder for themselves. So what they did, their strategy was they separated those that straggled in the back of the caravan, and they attacked them. So that would have been the frail, the weak, the elderly, the sick, children, mothers, nursing mothers. The Amalekites attacked those that were in the back of the caravan. And so this could have been, the only reason that God commanded haram, that total annihilation. But I don't think it is, because if we dig a little deeper and we consider, okay, now where did the Amalekites come from? And of course, there's different perspectives on this. Different biblical scholars, consider different things. But Amalek is a grandson of Esau. And I'll tie all of this together because it begins to become really important in how you can trace the Nephilim. So Esau had a son named Eliphaz, and Eliphaz had a Horite concubine named Timnah. Now, the Horites are listed in Genesis 14 among a list of tribes of giants. But it's not thought that the Horites themselves were a tribe of giants, but more that they intermingled or interbred with the giants. And so it's reasonable to think that Timnah, the Horite mother of Amalek, passed on potentially Nephilim genes to Amalek. But not only may he have had Nephilim genes, he also inherited the extreme hatred that Esau had towards Jacob. And so as the generations progress, the strife between Esau and Jacob's descendants intensified. And so that's kind of a little bit of the backdrop of who the Amalekites are. So now back to, why would God command Saul to haram the Amalekites? And probably it was, for two reasons. One is they were merciless in their attack on the burgeoning nation of Israel, but also because they interbred with the giants. And so they were furthering the Nephilim seed and defiling the human genome. So back to Saul. So during Saul's day, Agag was king of the Amalekites. So when Saul was commanded to haram the Amalekites, he was told he had to annihilate everyone, completely destroy everyone. But Saul did not walk in the fear of the Lord. And instead, he gave in to his whims and fancies and preserved King Agag. And what's really interesting is, so the Jewish historian Josephus, he says this about about Saul. He says, Saul also took Agag, the enemy's king, captive, the beauty and tallness of whose body he admired so much that he thought him worthy of preservation. giving way to human passions. He preferred the fine appearance of the enemy to the memory of what God had sent him about. So here we have Saul finding Agag attractive because of the tallness and beauty of his body. And so he, instead of walking in the fear of the Lord, he chooses to preserve someone with a defiled human genome. So in that particular battle in the seed war, Saul handed the victory over to the enemy, to Satan, because what he did on that day, and instead of walking in the fear of the Lord, he aligned himself with the seed of Satan. And I think that's precisely why Saul lost his kingship, was because of that choice of aligning with the seed of Satan. And so if we think about, Satan's strategy along the way has been to defile the human genome so that the Messiah couldn't be born. Well, we know he utterly failed at that, and Jesus won the seed war. So the Nephilim has had to slightly alter their agenda. So in the common era, the agenda still is to defile the human genome, but it's to destroy as many Jesus followers as possible, while also enslaving the masses through control, manipulation, and domination. And so the Nephilim agenda is essentially the same as the globalist agenda, and that is total domination of humanity. It's to usher in a new world order. And we actually, in history, we see this. This is the same agenda that Hitler operated under when he tried to create a perfect Aryan race to supplant humanity. And so it's part of that defiling the human genome. Now this is a fringe podcast anyway, so I'm going to talk to you briefly about transhumanism, creating humans 2.0. And what's interesting is while, this could be thought of on the fringe, but back in, I think it was either late November or early December. So the director of national intelligence, John Ratcliffe, who, served under President Trump, he wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. And then in early December, Maria Bartiromo had him on Sunday Morning Futures. And he was talking about the threat that China poses to our nation. And he was talking about how China's military has 2 million soldiers in it. But what China is doing, the People's Republic of China, they are using gene editing to strengthen their soldiers. So they are essentially altering the genetic code of their soldiers to create what's called super soldiers, or humans 2.0. And so these soldiers are known to be able to withstand harsher circumstances. They can last longer in battle than pure humans. And so when I heard that, I had done all this research for the book. And when I heard him say this, I'm like, this is no longer fringe. He just brought it right into the mainstream narrative. Not many people caught it. And, it's understandable. We have to, expose this truth in layers so that more and more people can understand. But it is happening right here, right now. And that's just one way that the Nephilim agenda is impacting us. And so when I think about, going back to the days of Noah, God in his omniscience, he knew that the Nephilim agenda would threaten humanity's existence all the way until the last days, the end of time. And so, I believe, I know there's all sorts of different perspectives on the flood, but I believe the flood was universal. And I also believe that God was successful in annihilating the Nephilim. But what he is consistent in is allowing free will in humanity. And so that free will, I believe, opened the door to the Nephilim offspring emerging after the flood.
this is not the first time we talked about this on the show. And one of the things we talked about with Tim Alberino specifically is the manipulation of the genetic code in a way that removes those things that make us human. And in so the darkness and Satan, they can usurp the throne. We've been given dominion here in this planet. So this is not a new idea for our show. I just want to point that out. This is something that we've talked about, and it does show up in the news. We talk about chips being implanted in people's heads for upgrades. Elon Musk is doing it with pigs right now. There's a thought process in this space that talks about the idea that there's certain things in our genome that uniquely make us human, and once we remove that, we've removed that thing that gives us the birthright to dominion here. As the Bible says, we'll judge angels on earth. We have dominion here. But yeah, back to, so do they do this Mount Hermon event again? Or do you think that it comes through the line of Ham? Like some people theorize, there was some Nephilim DNA on the ark itself.
Yeah, I am fascinated by this particular question. It's like the age-old question: how were there giants on the earth after the flood if God was successful in getting rid of the Nephilim? And so, like you said, there's two primary theories. There's the multiple incursion theory and then the single incursion theory. And I think, to have an incursion the same magnitude of Genesis 6, I don't think can be substantiated, but that doesn't mean there weren't other incursions that happened. If we consider the Mesopotamian culture with their sacred marriage practices and the ritualistic sex practices that they had between the divine and the priest or priestesses, that can be an example of multiple incursions. But what I find fascinating is considering the single incursion theory. And so, like you mentioned, epigenetics, I really feel like this is the key that unlocks the understanding of single incursion. And so, for those of your listeners that aren't too familiar with epigenetics, it essentially is, how our thoughts and behaviors and lifestyle choices impact our body, soul, and spirit. And it's not just how they impact us, it also impacts future generations. And so the prefix epi means on top of. And so epigenetics is a set of instructions that sits on top of the genome. And so another important aspect of this is to understand that there's something called epigenetic markers. And you can think of them like light switches. You can turn on or off this marker, and that controls kind of the expression of that particular gene. So as I mentioned, there's this transgenerational component, and this, I believe, really unlocks understanding in this area. So there's some fascinating research. I mentioned I love to learn, I love to research, so I can just get geeked out on this pathway of understanding this transgenerational component. But I'll share one interesting research that was done by a group of Swedish researchers back in 2006. And the lead researcher's name's Pembry. But what they did is they looked at eating and lifestyle choices of prepubescent boys. And what they found is that it can affect their progeny up to 2 generations. So what do I mean by that? So in looking at this research, what they found is that boys around the age of 10, if they overate and or smoked, their children and grandchildren had significantly shorter lifespans. So in building on that concept, there's an incredible book by Dr. Carolyn Leaf called Switch on Your Brain. And it's really good in helping understand epigenetics and how this can affect our generations. And she talks about how the sins of the parents create a predisposition in the children. So not a destiny, but a predisposition. And that our choices, which are epigenetic signals, alter the expression of genes, which are those epigenetic markers. And that can be passed on to our children and grandchildren. So essentially predisposing them before they're even conceived, which is mind-blowing to me.
Wow.
And so our bad choices can become their bad predispositions. And so with that as a backdrop, Then when we consider Genesis 6:9, it says, and these are the origins of Noah. Noah was a just man, being perfect in his generation. Noah was well-pleasing to God. So being perfect in his generation, or his genealogy, means that his genome was not defiled by the Nephilim. So he was 100% human, as were his wife and sons. Now, here's where I think, I tie in Ham's wife potentially having the Nephilim gene, as you mentioned, Luke. So I go into more in depth in this in my book in chapter 8, but if we think about Ham's pattern of sexual perversion in his life, it would be reasonable to conclude that maybe he chose a wife that had Nephilim genes in her, but had an epigenetic marker that turned off that gene. So you don't see the phenotype of the Nephilim in Ham's wife, but she carries that dormant gene within her, but the epigenetic marker is turned off. But a curse on her bloodline could flip the switch and turn that gene on. And so I believe we see that in the life of Nimrod. And so Ham's choices became Nimrod's bad predispositions, which he acted upon. Let me kind of connect the dots a little bit more for us. So if we think about then, there's a passage in Genesis 10:8. And if we read it in the English, it's one of those you can just pass over and go, well, that doesn't really make a lot of sense, but not really understand what's there. And Genesis 10:8 says, Cush begot Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one on the earth. Now, here's where, as I was digging into the etymology of the words, things just really began to unlock for me here. So first of all, if we think about Nimrod's name in the Hebrew, it means rebellion. And rebellion is a hallmark trait of the Nephilim. But also that phrase, he began, in the Hebrew, it's halal. And that means to profane, defile, or pollute oneself through ritual or sexual means. So I'm going to come back to that in a minute, because that is a really important clue. And then if we look at the Hebrew word for mighty men or mighty one in that passage, it's the term gibberer, which means mighty, strong, valiant, champion, giant, chief, tyrant, and also impetuous soldier or hunter. And it comes from the root word gabar, and that means to prevail, to be strong, to show oneself mighty, but also to act proudly toward God. And so here we have, if we think about the word gibberer, the first mention of gibberer is in Genesis 6:4, when it talks about the Nephilim and the giants. And so if you put all that together, we think about Nimrod. And Nimrod, he was not born with the phenotype of the Nephilim, but he defiled himself. He defiled his genome through those ritualistic sex acts. Now, again, if we would have just read over that passage without digging into the meaning of the Hebrew words, we would have completely missed it. And that's where I think the English translations leave us wanting, because we would never have picked up that clue that what Nimrod was engaged in was these ritualistic sex practices, and that could defile his human genome. So then we have, Nimrod's grandfather, Ham, through his iniquity of disrespectfully gazing upon Noah's nakedness. Now, some people believe it's even more than just gazing upon, but irregardless, it was a sexual perversion. It was evidence that there was sexual perversion there. So that created a predisposition for sexual perversion in his children and grandchildren. And so we see that emerge in the life of Nimrod. So then Ham's iniquity and Noah's curse, in conjunction with what I'm suggesting is that Ham's wife had that Nephilim gene that was turned off. Those things all together could set the stage for the Nephilim traits to emerge after the flood. And so we see that that free will that I mentioned earlier about, after the flood, God wiped out the Nephilim, but humanity still had free will. And through that free will and epigenetics, that could explain how the Nephilim and the offspring of the Nephilim emerged after the flood. And I believe that explains how Nimrod could began to be a giant.
I want to ask one thing about this, and I think this, first off, before I said the Tower of Babel before the flood, I was mixed up there. It's after the flood, and that's where Nimrod is. So I'll correct myself there. Secondly, the Bible talks about the sins of the father being passed on. This is I never thought about it in a very genetic way that's possible. Like not just, because we talked about with some paranormal stuff in some other episodes about how things happen in your family, up the family tree, and that causes things to happen down the family tree, whether it be weird spiritual stuff that ends up in a home or follows you, and like you've talked about in the very beginning about the land. But very literally here, we're talking about the sins of the father turning on, or having the ability to turn on genetic code that existed in the sequence that would have, then now brought the giants back. When we see the giants again after this, obviously we see them in David and Goliath's brothers, Og. The giants do make a return. It's just fascinating to me because I never thought about that. I always thought about sins of the father being that, alcoholism or these things that you see run in families, right? This makes a ton of sense. Anyway, this just was a light on for me. Interesting. Just interesting. I love this so far.
Well, it's funny because a couple years ago I went to get counseling, and the doctor was for health issues, and the doctor was talking about how a trauma in your grandparents' life can be written in the genetics, and it can cause health issues in your own life years later. And we did several sessions because I had some health issues I couldn't get to the bottom of. I was seeing alternate doctors, and that was one of my doctors recommended me go to him, and we did like 5 sessions, and he was talking about that. And it took me like 4 or 5 sessions with this doctor to listen to what he had to say, that you can turn off and on genes issues, and you have to heal from trauma sometimes to begin to heal physically, because if you have been messed up in your DNA, your body is in a state of fight or flight, and it can't heal. And I was like, dude, you're crazy, man. Like, I thought I was just wasting my time and energy because I thought clearly something's wrong with my body, but he was trying to get me to think about the ability for us to turn off genetic, like you were saying. We have these genetic... the
epigenetic markers.
Yeah, but we can control them too. We can decide whether we and neuroplasticity and all these different topics to get into this. But it took me a while for my mind to open up to that. But I'm tracking with you 100% that I think a lot of people, when they listen to this show, they think, well, how, obviously he would know if she was a giant. And it's like, no, it could have been a dormant gene that was hiding and he had no idea. But then Richard Sorensen said on our episode with him, we had him on a couple of days ago, he was talking about the psychosis of giants. And we talked about were the giants genetically psychotic, but then he talked about this weird sex act that happened with Noah and his sons after they got out of the ark. And he said that he got into more detail about it. He thinks something physically happened where they mess with him, and it sounds kind of like what you're talking about, that something was turned back on again, and then a couple generations down the line, then it really grew into something nasty where he became a giant. And but I also think, I think when it comes to this topic, I think all the above is my thought. Like, could some of them have been hiding underground and somehow, like, most of them got exterminated, but a few somehow survived? Or could there have been some weird genetic? Does it have to be just one? Can all of these things be a part of what happened?
Yeah, I think it's both and so let me describe a little bit more about Nimrod, and because I think he's an example of both multiple incursion and single incursion. And so, and also just back to what you were saying about when you went to get counseling for the health reasons, I think this is where I want to bring hope to us all, in that once we understand this and understand how important our choices are, not only for our future generations. So I don't have grandchildren yet, but the choices I'm making in my life now are going to impact my grandchildren, not just because I've shaped my children and how they might parent, but literally physically, it can shape my grandchildren. And so, likewise, when we think about that generational iniquity that may be in our bloodline, kind of going back, Luke, to what you were saying about we have dominion authority. We have authority to break off those curses, to cut that flow of junk that comes through our bloodline. And when we understand the importance of epigenetics, to me, it's beautiful how it all comes together, because here we have spiritual principles in scripture about blessings and curses. Blessings go for 1,000 generations, and the sins of the fathers, like you were saying, Luke, 3 and 4 generations. So we know that there's that spiritual truth of this transgenerational component to blessing and curses. But then you bring in the epigenetics, and that's kind of the scientific realm of it. And then, of course, being a psychologist, I love the psychological aspect of it. And so it really all comes together. But to understand that this could be one of the ways that the giants emerged is completely fascinating to me.
Yeah.
So anyways, back to the life of Nimrod. So one of the things that I did in my book was provide, through doing the research, what are the physical and behavioral characteristics of the Nephilim and their giant offspring. And some of it began here as I was looking at Nimrod. And so, through different resources, we can learn that Nimrod had this desire for control and manipulation. He wanted to dominate others. And so what he did is he suppressed his subjects using fear and intimidation. And those are clearly Nephilim traits. And Nimrod was Satan's first attempt at raising up a type of antichrist. And so when you think about that, and you think about the magnitude of Ham's choice led to the open door for Satan to raise up the first type of antichrist. And a lot of scholars would agree that Nimrod was the first world leader in human history. And so he was the first globalist, so to speak. And so here we have Nimrod, he's filled with this pride and arrogance. He thinks that he can lead the building of the Tower of Babel. That would be something that would outmaneuver the Almighty God. And it really was this pride of life that was rising up. And so if you think about the term Babel in the Akkadian language means gate of the gods, but it's also a play on the Hebrew word that means confusion. And so I started to think, okay, why were they building this Tower of Babel? And, we can look at scripture, and scripture talks about so that they can make a name for themselves. And when you look at, again, going back to the Hebrew meaning of that phrase, it really is about them creating a monument or a memorial so that it would draw fame and glory to them. They wanted to be known by subsequent generations and to be revered. And again, there's that pride of life. And so when you think about it, the Gibberer, so the Nephilim, they're known as the men of renown. And so in their offspring is this desire to be known as men of renown. And so you see that in Nimrod as he's building this Tower of Babel. He wanted to have that fame and glory, be known as a man of renown, if that makes sense. And so that I think is one reason, but there's another reason. I can't remember if you had these guys on your podcast before, but Thomas Horn and Chris Putnam, they wrote a book called On the Path of the Immortals. And they suggest in their book that the Tower of Babel is actually a Stargate. So kind of going back to what we were talking before about the portals and different dimensions and gateways. So they suggest that it's a Stargate that was inspired by the forbidden knowledge that was given by the sons of God, which is fascinating to me. And so, if we think about Nimrod as he began to be a mighty one or gibberer or a giant, that's a hybrid, right? And so within Nimrod is that unlocking of part of the divine, because the Nephilim, their fathers were 100% divine, and the mother was, human. And then the subsequent generations of offspring have that divine part within him. And so is that why Nimrod could discern where a portal or a gateway to the other dimensions were? And that's what he was building the Tower of Babel as kind of this temple or this place, so that there could be that sexual union between the divine and the human. And so that could be an example of how Nimrod both opened the door for multiple incursions, but also became a giant through a single incursion epigenetic theory.
That's interesting, because I know that they consider that to be the first ziggurat, right? And the ziggurat was meant to be built on top of a temple as a stairway, or you could even say a gateway for the gods. So for our listeners that aren't completely up to speed with the Fed, like, how do you tie this up with the Fed then? If I mean, obviously I know that it has to do with control, right? You said something interesting about how the satanic agenda had to do with fear, using fear and oppression to control. And I mean, all you could do is, this is what's going on right now in America, 2020, 2021. But how does that play into the Fed then? If we're looking at a Nephilim agenda and we're looking at how it came back, this is a great, we talked about at the beginning, very well prepared. This is such a great story arc. I love it. Then how do we connect it to what happened, Jekyll Island and the rest of the Fed stuff for our listeners that aren't, that may be not familiar, and also me included. Curious, yeah. Nate might know. Nate's hip with all the things.
Nate, what do you know?
What do I know? I don't know anything. All I know is I'm in Narnia and I'm fascinated because, like Luke was saying, it's one story. Like what you're describing is one full story. And like a lot of cryptic podcasts and cryptid shows, it's like to them, it's just all these random things happening. Like aliens coming down and spaceships flying across and Bigfoot coming out of the woods and someone sees a giant. And there is no whole arching story that explains all of it and it all fits inside. That's what I love what we're trying to do is we're trying to use Bigfoot as the gateway drug to see the weird Narnia story that goes all the way back. And now we have the remnant with the Fed being here today, but its roots tie all the way back to this domination, trying to enslave humans. So Luke and I were both trying to set up the same question kind of thing, but that's where I'm at.
Well done, sir. You were better than me.
Yeah. So how on earth does this all tie together to the Federal Reserve? And, the way I wrote the book is like an investigative journey where we're discovering things along the way. And as I mentioned before, I wrote it as in real time. So I was just as much on this investigative journey as the readers are as they read it. And there were times, like literally every day, I was like, okay, Lord, where are we going today? What are you going to show me? How does this even tie together? And he took me on these twists and turns that I had no idea I was going to go down and write about. And so I probably need to maybe build a little bit of a foundation to connect the giants of old to what we see now with the Nephilim agenda. And how I did that was in several ways. So the first way is, as I mentioned with Nimrod, I was able to begin to pull, like, what are these physical traits and behavioral characteristics of the Nephilim and their giant offspring? So I didn't just look at Nimrod, but I looked at Esau and what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah. I looked at Goliath, all these different characters, and began compiling, as a psychologist, I'm fascinated by this stuff. Like, what are the behavioral characteristics? And so in chapter 13 of my book, I coined the term Nephilim host. And what I mean by a Nephilim host is somebody who partners with the spiritual forces of darkness to carry out the Nephilim agenda. And so I believe there are Nephilim hosts, in addition to like the giants of Solomon Islands. I believe there are Nephilim hosts in and among us, potentially even running some of our institutions, that are carrying out the Nephilim agenda. But before we can get to that point of connecting the dots, we have to know like what characteristics are we looking for that would classify someone as a Nephilim host? Because, you know, given the ethereal nature of the Nephilim, I felt like it was really important to develop this set of criteria by which you could classify someone as a Nephilim host. And so I drew upon the concepts in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. So that's what we use as psychologists and psychiatrists will use, or social workers, when they are diagnosing someone with a mental disorder. But I have to give a disclaimer, because I'm by no means suggesting that what I came up with in chapter 13 can be used to determine a clinical diagnosis. And that's why I refer to it as proposed criteria for classification as a Nephilim host, because so much more research would need to be done to confirm that, in fact, these cluster of traits do adequately identify Nephilim host.
Right. So it's a hypothesis. So I mean, exactly. Yeah.
So I want to maybe run through these real quickly, these traits and physical traits and behavioral characteristics. And as I do, you and your listeners can begin to think of maybe world leaders, and I don't want to label anyone, but you can just think about some of these characteristics that maybe you've seen evident or coming to the surface or being exposed specifically in the last, since 2020. So there's two criterion. Criterion A is the physical traits, and criterion B are the behavioral characteristics. So the 4 physical traits, well, I should say this before getting into it. So what I propose is that you have to have at least 3 physical traits or 3 behavioral characteristics in order to be classified as a Nephilim host. However, if you don't have any physical traits, then you need to have at least 5 behavioral characteristics. Okay, so that's kind of the backdrop. So the physical traits are being excessively tall, and you would want to rule out gigantism, extraordinarily strong, polydactyly, which is having 6 fingers and or 6 toes, and then, don't get upset with me, Nate, but red hair. And
something's wrong with me. I knew it.
Oh, buddy.
My grandmother, who is my spiritual mentor, she had red hair, and I am by no means suggesting that you guys are Nephilim.
Hey, we're fiery. We're a fiery bunch.
Hey,
Yeah.
it's in the literature, though. We know that there was a lot of red-haired giants.
Yes, exactly. And so, what was interesting in doing my investigation, the color red became a bit of a calling card for the Nephilim and the Nephilim agenda. And so red was really symbolic for kind of, if you think about their fingerprints on different things throughout history. And so it really begins with Esau. And if we have time, I'll explain the significance between the transformation when Esau became Edom, because that right there is I always get my cliches wrong. Linchpin? Does that make sense? To tie
right.
the ancient giants to the Federal Reserve. Does that make sense?
That sounds right.
Yeah.
It's so funny. My wife is the absolute worst at sayings and cliches, so she'd be proud too. Because she always says it wrong. Bald as a bat. Her favorite one is to say bald as a bat. And I'm like, that doesn't make sense.
It's never laughing at me because I butcher cliche. So I was making sense.
It's perfect.
It's all good.
So yeah, as you mentioned, there's all sorts of things through historical documents that we can see where there's this connection between red hair and the giants. So, that starts with the Edomites, but as we see in the elongated skulls of Paracas, Peru, or the red-haired cannibals that terrorize the northern Paiute tribes in Nevada. There's the Tarim Basin mummies in China, the Celts, the Scythians, the Khazarians. And so it really emerged as this trait that can be seen in and linked to other Nephilim traits. And so that's why I include it. I don't want to offend anyone with red hair.
Oh, no one's offended.
Really, it would be foolish to, draw conclusions based on one epigenetic.
Well, Luke has all the other character traits, so
yes, except for the 6 fingers. Yeah, I used to have a bunch of red in my beard too. It's kind of gone by the wayside.
He's like 6'5", big, strong guy. So, are these Nephilim hosts groomed? Are they like sought after and then groomed and then like taken to Epstein's Island and like baptized into the Luciferian way? Is that how it goes down?
I think a lot of them are groomed. And then I think, obviously people can fall into that just by choices that they make as well.
But like curiosity, like, hey, come on out and we're doing this special Hollywood elite thing and you got to come. And then they don't realize what they're getting themselves into. Because everyone always thinks like, how are these narratives not known by the masses? I mean, how is this whole way to read the Bible swept under the rug? I mean, how do you even read the Old Testament and have a degree in theology and know nothing of what we're talking about the last hour? And then not know about all these elites around the world who have these ties back to these secret societies. And I like how you described it in one podcast I was listening to. You said it's a circle within a circle. So you have like a secret society, and most of those people don't know the inner circle. Right. It's just kind of a cover or a caveat for what's really going on, right?
Like the Masons, right?
Yeah,
like that. Like at the top, it's Luciferian doctrine, but at the bottom, it's like it's a boys' club. Everybody goes and they have a golf tournament in the garage sale, right? And
we're doing humanitarian project.
Right.
Yeah, very much so. That's the other symbol. There were 2 symbols throughout my investigation: red, and then this not what I call, but the circumpunct, which is the circle within the circle. But so, it kind of back to the red hair thing, just to close that loop. It would be foolish on any of these physical traits to make a determination. You need a cluster of traits, just like it would be foolish for me to diagnose someone as schizophrenic with only one symptom. You have to have, a grouping of symptoms to have that. So then if we think about the behavioral characteristics, I think this is where, as I read these, you'll really begin to kind of connect the dots with what you were just talking about, Nate, with, some of the stuff that happened on Epstein Island, these Luciferian elites and their practices. So let me run through these. Again, there's 19 behavioral characteristics. So lustfulness in conjunction with sexual misconduct, deceitfulness as indicated by repeated lying and purposeful misrepresentation for personal profit and pleasure, pervasive pattern of instability in relationships marked by control, manipulation, intimidation, and domination over others, rebellious behavior and disregard for the rule of law, haughty and prideful as if above reproach, vengeful or inappropriate intense anger, participation in sorcery, witchcraft, and or the occult, reoccurring violent acts displaying disregard for the rights of others, lack of remorse for heinous acts against other living beings, excessive focus on death-related topics and or symbolism, underlying dark personality that is masked by overinflated self-righteousness, dishonesty in trade and business transactions with a propensity toward corruption. And now these last 7 I'll read, they're even more extreme. And what I propose in my book is that if someone has just 2 of these in the last 7 I'll read, then they can be classified as a Nephilim host, irregardless if they have any other traits. And so these are sexual perversion involving pedophilia, sexual domination of others against their will, and or bestiality, trafficker of humans, engage in cannibalism, commit treasonous acts, pervasive pattern of engagement in sexual and or blood occult rituals, commit human sacrifices, and the enslavement of others. And so those are the behavioral characteristics. And I'd have to say, after my book got published, I'm a researcher, so I'm continuing to research. And in looking in to transhumanism more, I actually would add a fifth physical trait, and that would be someone with an altered genetic code. So back to your question of how do I connect the dots to the Federal Reserve? So once I was able to identify these physical and behavioral characteristics, that allowed me then to trace this agenda and Nephilim host throughout history. I mentioned just a few minutes ago about the transformation between Esau and Edom, or to Edom, and that was huge in connecting the dots. So I want to pause because I want to keep going if you had more questions or things you wanted to say about those behavioral characteristics.
No, we heard Richard kind of went into detail about that on the previous episode a couple ago. So I'd love to hear the Edom connection because we kind of explored some of that already.
I feel like one of the purposes I have right now and why I wrote this book and why I continue to write is really to expose the deeds of darkness and to bring those to light, because my next book I just started is going to be called Generation Hoodwinked, and it's really looking at the mind control that the globalists use to enslave us. And so many of us just have no idea what's going on. It's like we're blind to it, but yet we're living under that enslavement. And so, yeah, it's really important to understand that these aren't just, stories about giants from old, that there's a wicked agenda attached to this, and it's busy being rolled out right before us. And, we can see it more and more. The more that we look, and, you turn on your television and you can begin to see it more and more if you know what you're looking for. So,
yeah. And I was going to say, most people listening to this podcast, you get a feel for our audience, and all these topics, you can see they're kind of rebellious against the New World Order. They're talking about all the mandates and that have come down since the virus, and people are very aware. Listen to our show, and it's funny how Bigfoot can be a gateway drug to see the matrix that you're living in. I think that's what you're talking about. We're in this matrix, and a show like ours, you can't. For me, I couldn't just hear stories of Bigfoot and be like, oh yeah, there's nothing else going on in the world that's weird. You start to listen to other stories and other stories and other stories, and then you kind of find this narrative. And for me, it was like I found the giants. And I'm totally tracking with you that the giants are related to this New World Order that's controlling things and pulling the strings. And some people think, it's conspiracy theories. But no, it's just a willingness to see the truth. So yeah, I guess
I want to draw a line too real quick just for our listeners as well. I mean, it's no accident that we've talked about the demonic in ways, but it's really disembodied spirits of the giants, right? That's biblically what we're looking at. So when we look at these things that Dr. Laura's talking about, and we say those are kind of demonic traits, that's not an accident. It's not an accident. This stuff came from, if we're saying that what we consider to be demons are the disembodied spirits of the giants, which were demonic, then the stuff we consider to be, quote, demonic in these traits, whether it be pedophilia and human trafficking, cannibalism, all these really gross, disgusting, depraved things, the connection is a straight line. And I think that's what you're spelling out here, which I think is super important, because it connects the whole creature thing with today. And, what so continue. I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, no, that's good. And Nate, you mentioned, we're living in the Matrix. Keanu Reeves said that the Matrix was a documentary. And so that's really interesting. Considering. So, okay, back to Esau, the transformation from Esau to Edom. So if we think about the connection, the symbolism of the color red. The first time in the Hebrew language that the color red was mentioned in scripture was in connection when Esau was born. And it's the Hebrew word Adamone or Adamoni. And it means red, reddish of the hair complexion. And so there's a transformation, like I mentioned, that took place between Esau when he became Edom. And the Hebrew word for Edom is Adam. And one of the meanings is to be red. And so when I thought about that, I'm like, what the heck does that mean, Lord? What does it mean to be red? And so I began looking at just the biblical meaning of the color red, throughout scripture. What does red represent? And of course, we know that red represents the blood of Jesus. So that would be a positive connotation. But the preponderance of connection with the color red biblically is more of a negative connotation, aligned with the seed of Satan. And so, like in Isaiah, red represents sin or the blood of evil deeds. In Revelation 6, it's chaos, death, and destruction. In Revelation 12, it's Satan himself. And then also in Revelation 17, it's the beast, mystery Babylon, and martyrdom. So then when we think about Esau chose to be red, this choice had substantial ramifications upon his generational line. If we think about all that we've talked about today and that connection with the choices we make and how it impacts our future generations. So Esau branded himself red, or Edom, when he willingly traded his birthright for red lentil stew. Now, something much deeper was at play here than just he wanted some red stew. And what happened was Esau sealed a transaction, and one that would constrict his allegiance to a particular seed, because on that day, he aligned with the seed of Satan by rejecting the birthright blessing of Abraham and Isaac. So on that fateful day, he separated himself from Yahweh. And that's really important to understand. And then I began kind of looking at, okay, what was the personality of Esau? Again, to formulate those criteria for the Nephilim host. And, we learned from scripture that he was a hunter, he was cunning, he was a man of the field. And again, kind of digging into the etymology of the words, that Hebrew word for hunter is said, but it comes from a root word, sud. And what that means is to lie in wait, to chase, and to take provision. And so, we can kind of piece things together that Esau was this rugged outdoorsman. He was skilled at hunting. He probably loved the thrill of the hunt, where he stalked his prey and then moved in for the kill. But what's interesting is there's a figurative meaning of the word sud, and it's applied to someone who lies in wait to catch a human. So now I think about human trafficking, but it also is someone who will entrap another person for the purpose to exploit them for their own personal gain. Now, I don't have a ton of time to go into the Federal Reserve, but therein explains the Federal Reserve, where it's really a debt enslavement system that we've been trapped by, and it exploits us for the personal gain of what I call the elite banksters. But you can read about that in my book if you want.
Yeah.
So as we think about so the meaning of these things to describe Esau's personality, but then we consider extra biblical texts like the book of Joshua. And in chapter 27, it actually goes into detail about the hunting expedition that Esau was on prior to that exchange of his birthright. So at the time, Esau and Nimrod were both known as incredible hunters. And the book of Joshua records that Esau was, stalking Nimrod. So Nimrod and his men were out in the fields. They were hunting. Esau was hidden And when Nimrod came close enough, he jumped out from being concealed, took his sword, and cut the head of Nimrod off. And he killed 2 of his men. And so Esau was on the run from the rest of Nimrod's men. And so that is the backdrop to the story when he runs into the tent, weak and famished and weary, faint, because he's on the run from Nimrod's men. And that's when he finds Jacob making the red lentil stew. And so another little interesting tidbit is red lentil stew traditionally was the meal that the firstborn son would prepare for the grieving parent. And so here we have Isaac grieving the loss of Abraham. And instead of Esau being the firstborn, caring for his father by preparing this meal, he's off in the field killing things. And so that's the backdrop to how Esau transformed to become Edom, because Esau chose to be red by covering his hands with the murderous blood of Nimrod instead of fulfilling his role as a loving firstborn son.
It's crazy.
It's heavy.
It is.
It's heavy
there. Yeah.
And my last question for you is, so many people on our show talk about these extra biblical books. Is the Vatican and some of these top dogs who are involved with this enslavement system, were they instrumental in removing some of the material that gave context to to keep this story confusing?
I'll offer my opinion, because that is something I'm definitely going to research for this next book I'm writing. My hunch is yes. That these extra biblical texts, because, we know the book of Enoch, some of the New Testament writers reference it, and some of these other extra biblical texts are referenced in scripture. And so, they thought highly of it enough to incorporate it in their writing. So I haven't done a ton of research on it, but my hunch is that this is part of potentially some of the mind control, is to separate us from the full scriptures that give us the full context. And that may have been done by design so that we don't understand the Nephilim and the Nephilim agenda. But that is my opinion at this point. And like I said, I'm going to be doing a lot more research on that.
Yeah.
I say it's interesting too that Enoch in the beginning talks about it is set aside for a time. It seems like the world's waking up. Dr. Laura Sanger, thanks for coming on. I know your time here is we're coming to the end, but would love for you to share with our listeners where they can find your work, find out what you're doing, where they could connect with the research and the things you're putting out. So a little plug for wherever you'd like to send people to listen to the show.
Probably the best way to connect with me is on my website, which is nolongerenslaved.com. If you're interested in my book, you can purchase it from there or directly from Amazon or Barnes & Noble. But also, I've written a ton of articles, particularly on COVID-19, the vaccine, different things like that. And I write them in such a way that people who aren't awake to the agenda behind it can read it and begin to ask questions and maybe wonder why. So it's kind of an intro into understanding the backdrop of all that I've talked about today without putting any of that in those articles. So it's a way to kind of waken people up. Those are all on my website as well as previous interviews I've done. Those are in the video section.
Awesome.
So you say those articles are like the Bigfoot. The gateway.
Oh, the gateway, yes.
Yeah, I love it. It's hard for some people. They need to be taken along the way. And I like how you described in the beginning of the episode of how when you were writing your book, it's like every day was a little bit more that you could handle to the next day as this information kept coming at you. And that's kind of what we're trying to do on our show. And that's the same thing that happened to me in a completely different realm of stuff that I was listening to. It was like a podcast that started another podcast. And then you can get a little bit more and it gets a little bit stranger and you can handle that strangeness as you progress and open your mind to, hey, I've got to relearn everything here. And so we appreciate you coming on and dropping some hard truths. I know that a lot of people freak out about some of these topics, the New World Order, and I think it's just a bunch of conspiracy theories, but the story goes all the way back to the days of Noah, and Jesus talks about the days of Noah in Matthew 23. And so whatever was going on then is still around, and people still see these creatures, and it all makes sense in one story. And that's kind of what we're on the journey of. Creatures is our gateway to get weird and get people's minds to open up. So thank you for giving us because what we're trying to figure out is how these giants relate to these creatures, and this story is just, it's so much bigger than we anticipated and more fascinating, and there's so many ways you can go with it. So hopefully this fits into our creatures category for listeners, but I think it does.
Yeah.
I think it does.
I'd love to have you back. I think we just scraped some of the surface, and so
I'd love to come back. Yeah. It was great to talk with you guys. I love the way you think and the questions you ask. I mean, it helps us further our understanding, and that's what we need to do in this time.
Yeah. Appreciate that. Yeah, we feel like two dummies just trying to make sense of what's going on out there. But you listen to enough Bigfoot podcasts and it was driving me nuts. I'm like, what are these things, and how does it make sense to the biblical story, which I believe is true? Do they talk about this stuff? And what do you know? Like, it just gets weird. So we appreciate the nice words, and I love it, and it's just amazing how it fits into because we just had Doug Van Dorn talking about conspiracies this week. So we just talked about that. And then Richard Sorensen talked about the psychosis of the giants. And we're talking. So it's like everyone comes on this show, and it's like, and I don't, we can't.
And we had a Mason on.
We did have a Mason on.
It just it gets weird.
Yeah, we didn't even know he was a Mason.
No,
And he launched into it. We're like, okay, all right, so here we go. But it seems like Blurry Creatures is telling its own story, and we're just kind of in the driver's seat going 100 miles an hour. We don't even know where we're going, but we're going. So we appreciate you. We appreciate you taking over the wheel and driving us around today, because there's a lot. We got to get to that island, Luke. Man, that seems...
Which one?
With all the giants on it.
Sardinia? The Solomon Islands. I know you missed a few islands. I know you weren't talking about Epstein's Island, because that would have been really strange.
No, not that island.
Yeah, but Solomon Island. Yeah, the Solomon Islands and Sardinia. We got places to go, Nathan.
I can't believe I haven't heard of that island, man. We got to talk about that. That seems fascinating. Well, thank you so much for coming on again, and we'll let you know if you when your next book comes out for sure. We'll have you back. But if you find anything and you think it fits into our wheelhouse, send us an email and we'll do it.
Sounds great.
Thank you, Laura.
All right, take care, guys.